4:30 in the morning, the Philippine Sea, 200 miles east of the Luzon Strait. USS Gerald R. Ford was already cutting through the heavy Pacific swells when the first ghost appeared on the glass of the primary air search radar. The massive carrier, a city of steel displacing 100,000 tons, vibrated with the familiar low-frequency hum of its nuclear reactors. For the last 72 hours, the strike group had been operating under a state of heightened awareness, but the air in the Combat Direction Center was still thick with the smell of stale coffee and the ozone of high-powered electronics. This was not a routine contact, nor was it a sensor glitch caused by the morning mist. At coordinates 15 degrees north, 124 degrees east, a series of high-altitude signatures blossomed across the tactical display. They were moving at speeds exceeding Mach 6, descending from the upper atmosphere in a ballistic arc that pointed directly at the heart of the American formation. Within seconds, the single contact fractured into a dozen, then 20, and finally 48 distinct tracks. The radar operator, a second-class petty officer with 3 years of experience, did not hesitate. He called out the vampire inbound alert with a voice that was flat, professional, and entirely devoid of the terror that should have accompanied the realization that 48 anti-ship missiles were currently screaming toward their position. The call for general quarters shattered the pre-dawn silence. Throughout the 15 decks of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the rhythmic clanging of the alarm sent 5,000 sailors racing to their stations. Watertight doors were slammed and dogged down, transforming the ship into a honeycomb of armored compartments. On the flight deck, the air was cold and carried the sharp, biting scent of jet fuel and the salt spray kicked up by the carrier's 30-knot transit. The 4 electromagnetic catapults, silent only moments before, began to whine as they built the massive electrical charge required to hurl 30 tons of combat-loaded aircraft into the dark sky. Above the strike group, an E-2 Delta Hawkeye early warning aircraft circled at 30,000 feet. Its massive rotating dome was the primary eye of the fleet, feeding a torrent of data back to the Aegis weapon systems of the escorting ships. The tactical data link hummed with information, connecting the carrier to its shield, the cruiser CG-73, and the destroyers DDG-116 and DDG-117. This was the cooperative engagement capability in action. A single, unified defensive brain distributed across 4 ships, hundreds of miles of ocean, and dozens of interceptor missiles. The threat was a coordinated saturation strike, a mathematical attempt to overwhelm the defensive processors of the American fleet. The incoming volley consisted of 24 DF-21 Delta Carrier Killer ballistic missiles and 24 YJ-12 supersonic cruise missiles. The ballistic threats were coming from the north, plunging down from the edge of space, while the cruise missiles were hugging the wave tops, hiding in the radar clutter of white-capped sea. It was a pincer movement designed to force the American commanders to choose between looking up or looking out. In the flag bridge, the admiral watched the digital display as the 48 red icons closed the distance. The range was now 300 miles, then 280. At these speeds, the engagement window was measured in minutes, not hours. The air in the room was chillingly quiet, the only sound being the soft clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of the tactical action officer confirming weapon release authorities. The United States Navy had spent decades preparing for this exact moment, the technological collision between the most advanced carrier strike group in history and the full weight of a peer competitor's missile inventory. The admiral leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the cluster of interceptor status bars. The Mark 41 vertical launch systems on the surrounding destroyers were already primed. The explosive bolts on the canister hatches were ready to fire, and the solid fuel rocket motors of the standard missiles were warming to their ignition temperatures. There would be no warning shots today. There would be no diplomatic signaling. The 48 incoming tracks represented a clear and present intent to sink the centerpiece of American naval power. "Batteries released," the admiral said, his voice barely above a whisper. Beneath the keel of the Gerald R. Ford, the deep Pacific remained dark and indifferent. But on the surface, the ocean was about to be torn apart by the white-hot fury of the Aegis shield. The first phase of the most significant naval engagement of the 21st century was about to begin, and the question of whether the aircraft carrier was 4:31 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The tactical display was no longer a map of the sea, but a geometry of impending violence. The glowing blue icons representing the American strike group were being converged upon by 48 crimson streaks, each one a precision-engineered instrument of destruction. This was the opening move of a campaign designed to push the United States Navy out of the Philippine Sea forever. The sensors on the carrier and its 3 escorts were processing millions of data points every second, attempting to calculate the optimal intercept solutions for a threat that was moving faster than any human could comprehend. The strike originated from the mainland, nearly 600 miles to the northwest. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force had initiated a coordinated launch sequence from mobile transporter erector launchers hidden within the karst mountains of southeastern China. The mission was a textbook execution of a saturation attack, a mathematical strategy designed to exceed the processing power and magazine capacity of the Aegis weapon system. By launching 48 missiles simultaneously, the adversary hoped to find the leakage point the moment where the defensive screen became overwhelmed, allowing even a single warhead to punch through and cripple the 100,000-ton carrier. The threat profile was split into 2 distinct tiers of danger. The upper tier consisted of 24 DF-21 Delta anti-ship ballistic missiles. These weapons, often called carrier killers, had reached an apogee in the lower reaches of space before pitching over for their terminal descent. They were now falling at nearly 10 times the speed of sound, their heat shields glowing white-hot as they frictionally heated the thin atmosphere. At coordinates 18 degrees north, 123 degrees east, they were beginning their final active radar search, looking for the massive electromagnetic signature of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The lower tier was equally lethal, but far more subtle. 24 YJ-12 supersonic cruise missiles were skimming the wave tops at altitudes of less than 15 meters. These missiles moved at 3 times the speed of sound, staying below the radar horizon for as long as possible to minimize the reaction time of the American destroyers. The sea beneath them was a blur of white foam and dark water, the air thick with the smell of salt, and the heavy, sulfurous exhaust of their ramjet engines. They were the wolves in the tall grass, intended to strike just as the defenders were distracted by the hammer blows falling from the sky. Inside the carrier, the environment was a sharp contrast to the chaotic speed of the incoming missiles. The air was chilled to precisely 68 degrees to protect the sensitive server racks that powered the ship's brain. The only sound was the low, rhythmic murmur of the tactical action officer and the faint clicking of trackballs. Every sailor in the room was aware of the stakes. A single hit from a DF-21 Delta, carrying a 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead at hypersonic speeds, would be equivalent to the energy of a freight train hitting a brick wall. It would not just damage the ship, it would end its mission. The Admiral stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the timeline of intercept. The strike group was currently positioned in a diamond formation, with the cruiser CG-73 leading the way, and the destroyers DDG-116 and DDG-117 flanking the carrier. This formation was designed to maximize the Frandad overlapping fields of fire for their Mark 41 vertical launch systems. Within those steel cells sat the answer to the Chinese rockets, a mix of Standard Missile 6 interceptors for the high-altitude threats and Standard Missile 2 missiles for the medium-range defense. Tactical analysis suggested the first impacts would occur in exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The logistics of the defense were already being calculated by the Aegis computers. To ensure a high probability of a kill, the doctrine required 2 interceptors for every incoming ballistic missile. This meant the strike group would need to launch nearly 96 missiles in a matter of seconds to guarantee the safety of the carrier. It was a massive expenditure of ammunition. a literal wall of fire that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build in the sky. The admiral turned to his communications officer. The order was given to activate the full power of the AN SPY-6 radar systems. This was the electronic equivalent of turning on a searchlight in a dark room. It told the enemy exactly where the strike group was, but it was the only way to track 48 targets with the precision required for a kinetic kill. The radar beams swept the horizon and the heavens, painting the incoming missiles with high-energy pulses that reflected back to the waiting interceptors. The first of the Mark 41 hatches on the Civic lead destroyer blew open with a violent crack of explosive bolts. A split second later, a pillar of white flame erupted from the deck, followed by another and another. The counterattack had begun. The Philippine Sea, which had been a place of pre-dawn stillness only minutes ago, was now the site of the most intense missile engagement in the history of naval warfare. 4:32 in the morning. The nerve center of the strike group, buried deep within the armored citadel of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The air in the combat direction center was thick with the smell of ionized air and the faint, metallic scent of overheating processors. This was the Aegis network in its highest state of activity, a digital web of light and data that stretched across hundreds of miles of dark water. At the heart of this web was the AN SPY-6 radar system. Unlike the older radars of the previous generation, these four massive arrays, bolted to the sides of the carrier's island, did not rotate. They pulsed, sending out millions of individual beams of high-frequency energy that sliced through the morning mist and the heavy Pacific air. To the sailors watching the consoles, the radar was no longer just a tool. It was a physical presence. They could feel the subtle vibration in the deck plates, as the massive electrical draw of the radar system taxed the ship's nuclear reactors. Every pulse of energy was a searchlight, illuminating the 48 incoming threats with such precision that the system could distinguish between the nose cone of a missile and the debris of a falling booster stage. This was the first time the AN SPY-6 had been tested against a full-scale saturation strike, and the processing power required was staggering. The true strength of the American defense, however, was not just in one ship. It was in the cooperative engagement capability. This system functioned as a single, unified brain for the entire strike group. Through a high-speed, jam-resistant data link, the USS Gerald R. Ford was sharing every single radar return with the cruiser, CG-73, and the destroyers, DDG-116 and DDG-117. If the carrier's radar was blocked by the curvature of the Earth or the heavy swell of the sea, the destroyers further north could see the target and pass that information back instantly. System handshake confirmed. The tactical action officer reported. Data link is green across the board. We have a single integrated air picture. On the tactical screens, the 48 red tracks were no longer just dots. They were now high-fidelity digital models. Their speed, altitude, and projected impact points calculated to within a few meters. The Aegis computers were performing a complex mechanical ballet, assigning specific interceptors to specific targets. It was an exercise in pure logic. Which ship had the best angle of fire, which missile had the highest probability of a kill, and which target represented the SpaceX most immediate threat to the carrier. The blue glow of the consoles reflected in the wide eyes of the operators. Their hands moved with practiced precision, hovering over the firing keys but not yet pressing them. The system was largely automated, now designed to fire at speeds that no human reflex could match. The role of the sailors was to monitor the kill chain, ensuring that the computers did not double task or leave a single gap in the shield. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the cooling fans and the steady, rhythmic chirping of the threat warning receivers. At coordinates 16 degrees north, 123 degrees east, the first wave of interceptors began to clear the horizon. These were the Standard Missile-6 missiles, launched from the Mark 41 vertical launch systems of the escorting destroyers. They rose on pillars of white-hot flame, their solid-fuel rocket motors roaring as they fought against the pull of gravity. to reach the upper atmosphere. Each interceptor carried its own active radar seeker, a miniature version of the ship's own eye, designed to hunt down the DF-21 Delta ballistic missiles as they began their final plunge. The environment outside the ship was a scene of controlled violence. The sky was being torn apart by the white exhaust trails of the outgoing interceptors, creating a spiderweb of smoke that stretched from the surface of the ocean to the edge of space. The cold morning air, which had been silent only minutes before, was now a cacophony of thunderous launches and the screaming of wind past the supersonic airframes. Below the waterline, the sonar operators heard the distant, muffled echoes of the ship's own fury, the sound of the launches vibrating through the steel hull. The Admiral watched the range to intercept countdown. 2 minutes and 40 seconds remained until the first kinetic collision. The Aegis network had done its job. It had seen the threat, analyzed it, and lashed out with a precision that was the culmination of 40 years of naval engineering. But the 48 incoming missiles were not static targets. They were maneuvering, their own onboard computers fighting to find a way through the digital wall the Americans had built in the sky. The Battle of the Brains had begun, and the first piece of falling debris was about to hit the water. 4:33 in the morning, 60 miles north of the USS Gerald R. Ford. 4 F-35 Bravo fighters and 6 FA-18 fighter jets were already screaming through the thin, cold air at 30,000 feet. The pilots felt the steady, crushing weight of 3 Gs as they banked their aircraft into a wide interceptor arc, their engines glowing like distant stars against the black velvet of the Pacific sky. This was the outer air battle, the first layer of the American shield, where the goal was to kill the Archer before the arrows could land, or in this case, to strike the arrows while they were still far from the heart of the fleet. The cockpit air was dry and smelled of bottled oxygen, and the faint electric tang of high-powered avionics humming at maximum capacity. At coordinates 17 degrees 10 minutes north, 123 degrees 40 minutes east, the first of the YJ-12 cruise missiles crossed into the engagement envelope of the combat air patrol. The F-35 Bravo pilots did not use their own radars, remaining electronically silent and invisible to the enemy's seekers. Instead, they acted as silent snipers, receiving high-fidelity target data, fed directly into their helmet-mounted displays via the Link 16 data network from the E-2 Delta Hawkeye circling far above. To the pilots, the world was a digital construct of green symbols and red diamonds, where the horizon was merely a line on a glass visor. Fox 3. The lead pilot whispered into his mask, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. With a series of sharp, metallic clunks, 8 AIM-120 advanced, medium-range air-to-air missiles dropped from the internal weapons bays of the F-35 Bravo fighters. A split second later, the solid rocket motors ignited, with a violent, white flash that momentarily bleached the cockpit monitors. The missiles surged forward, accelerating to 4 times the speed of sound, in less than 5 seconds, leaving behind thin ribbons of white smoke that hung in the frozen air. These were independent hunters, each carrying its own active radar seeker to find and destroy the low-flying cruise missiles. The FA-18 fighter jets, acting as the heavy hitters of the formation, followed suit by ripple-firing their own complements of interceptors. The sky was suddenly filled with dozens of white streaks, all diving toward the surface of the ocean where the YJ-12 missiles were hugging the waves. The pilots watched as their tactical displays began to update in real time. The red diamonds representing the enemy missiles beginning to flicker and vanish as the AIM-120 warheads found their marks. The ocean surface miles below was lit by the distant orange glows of successful intercepts, like fireflies flickering out over a dark field. Tactical analysis from the Hawkeye confirmed that 12 of the 24 cruise missiles had been neutralized in the first 30 seconds of the aerial engagement. The debris from the shattered Chinese missiles was scattered across 10 miles of open water, sinking rapidly into the Philippine Sea. However, 12 of the YJ-12 missiles remained, their onboard computers executing violent, pre-programmed evasive maneuvers to dodge the incoming American fire. These survivors were now dropping even lower, flying so close to the water that their exhaust was kicking up a continuous spray of salt and mist. The fighter pilots pushed their throttles forward into full afterburner, the sudden surge of power kicking them back into their seats, with 60,000 pounds of thrust. They were racing to re-engage, but the remaining cruise missiles were already crossing the 50-mile mark from the carrier. The battle was moving too fast for the aircraft to catch them all. The pilots had done their part, thinning the herd and providing the fleet with precious seconds of reaction time. Now, the mission of defending the USS Gerald R. Ford shifted, from the cockpit to the deck plates of the escorting ships. Inside the carrier, the tactical action officer acknowledged the kills from the air wing but remained focused on the 48 threats that had now become 36. The ballistic missiles were still falling from the heavens, and the remaining cruise missiles were now within the visual horizon of the destroyers. The air above the flight deck was thick, with the smell of burnt propellant as the ship's own point defense systems began to cycle their ammunition feeds. The outer wall had been breached, and the mid-tier defense was the only thing standing between the carrier and a catastrophic impact. The Admiral watched the status of the escorting cruiser CG-73. The ship was a bristling fortress of sensors and missiles, and it was now the primary shooter for the next phase of the engagement. The cooperative engagement capability was shifting the fire control priorities, ensuring that no two ships wasted an interceptor on the same target. The professionalism of the United States Navy was being tested by fire and steel, and the window for error was closing with every heartbeat. 4:34 in the morning. The cruiser CG-73 positioned 5 miles off the port bow of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The cruiser was the primary shooter for the high-altitude engagement, its 212 vertical launch cells acting as the strike group's heavy artillery. On the bridge, the green glow of the tactical displays illuminated the focused faces of the bridge crew, while the ship itself groaned under the strain of high-speed maneuvers. The air was heavy with the ozone of the massive SPY-1 radar arrays, and the sea outside was a churn of black water and white foam. As the cruiser held its station, the tactical action officer confirmed that the 24 DF-21 Delta ballistic missiles had entered the final engagement window, their speed now exceeding Mach 10 as they plunged through the mesosphere. The trigger was squeezed. The first Standard Missile 6 shrieked off the rail of the cruiser, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors standing nearest to the superstructure, the temperature of the exhaust briefly reaching thousands of degrees. The smoke rose in a dense, white column that blotted out the horizon for 3 full seconds, the sound of the launch a physical hammer blow that rattled every bolt in the ship's hull. Within 10 seconds, 12 more interceptors followed, erupting from the Mark 41 vertical launch system in a rapid-fire sequence that turned the cruiser's foredeck into a lake of fire. High above the clouds, at an altitude of nearly 100,000 meters, the first Standard Missile 6 found its prey. The warhead did not just explode, it functioned as a kinetic kill vehicle, slamming into the incoming DF-21 Delta with the combined speed of 15 times the speed of sound. The impact was a silent, blinding flash of white light that bleached the sky, instantly vaporizing the 3,000-pound Chinese missile into a cloud of glowing plasma and shredded titanium. The force of the collision was so great that the shockwave, even in the thin air of the upper atmosphere, sent a visible ripple through the clouds below. The remaining Chinese ballistic missiles did not simply continue on their paths. Their onboard guidance computers, detecting the high-energy radar pulses of the American interceptors, triggered lateral thrusters to execute violent, high-G evasive maneuvers. The red tracks on the American tactical screens danced and flickered as the missiles twisted in their descent, fighting to break the radar lock of the Aegis system. But the Standard Missile 6 was equally agile, its own nose-mounted active radar seeker correcting its flight path 40 times every second to maintain a collision course with the maneuvering threats. White-hot debris began to rain down from the edge of space. Streaks of orange light, cutting through the darkness like falling stars. The sky was no longer black. It was a chaotic tapestry of ionizing radiation and burning metal. As more intercepts were confirmed by the Aegis computers, the immediate aftermath was a haunting silence in the upper atmosphere, followed by the distant, muffled thud of secondary explosions as the falling debris frictionally heated and broke apart in the denser air of the stratosphere. The radar screens of the strike group cleared momentarily, showing that 18 of the 24 ballistic carrier killers had been successfully neutralized in the high-tier envelope. Inside the cruiser, the smell of burning propellant began to filter through the ventilation system. A sharp, chemical bite that served as a reminder of the violence, occurring just hundreds of feet above the deck. The crew remained disciplined, their hands moving over their consoles to prepare the next salvo. They knew the job was only half finished. 6 ballistic missiles had survived the first layer of the shield, and the 12 sea-skimming cruise missiles were now less than 30 miles away, moving at 3 times the speed of sound just above the waves. The admiral on the USS Gerald R. Ford watched the status bars for the interceptors. The strike group had already expended 36 Standard Missile 6 missiles to achieve those 18 kills, a necessary but staggering cost. The magazine depth of the escorts was being tested, and the engagement was shifting into the medium-range envelope. The tactical action officer reported that the destroyers DDG-116 and DDG-117 were now taking over primary fire control, their Mark 41 cells already cycling for the next launch. The Philippine Sea was now a battlefield defined by seconds. The surviving ballistic missiles were less than 60 seconds from impact, and the cruise missiles were seconds from appearing on the carrier's own visual sensors. The professional resolve of the United States Navy was the only thing holding the line against the 48-missile volley that had been intended to end the era of the American carrier. The shield was holding, but the most dangerous phase of the battle, the close-in engagement, was about to begin. 4, 34, and 30 seconds in the morning, the destroyers DDG-116 and DDG-117 positioned on the northern flanks of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The mid-tier engagement began with a series of synchronized detonations that shook the hulls of the 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. As the 6 surviving DF-21 Delta ballistic missiles crossed the 40-mile threshold, they entered the optimal engagement zone for the Standard Missile 2 Block 3B interceptors. Simultaneously, the 12 YJ-12 cruise missiles were now appearing above the radar horizon of the destroyers, their supersonic signatures creating a wall of electronic noise that the SPY-6 radar systems had to sift through with extreme precision. The air around the destroyers was thick, with the acrid stink of burnt powder and the heavy, humid scent of the Philippine Sea. At coordinates 14 degrees 58 minutes north, 124 degrees 12 minutes east, the destroyer DDG-116 unleashed a volley of 24 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. These smaller, highly agile interceptors were packed 4 to a cell in the Mark 41 vertical launch system, allowing the ship to throw a massive volume of fire into the path of the incoming sea skimmers. The launches were so rapid that they appeared as a single, continuous stream of white fire reaching out toward the horizon, the sound a rhythmic series of thundering cracks that vibrated through the steel deck plates and into the boots of every sailor on board. The Standard Missile, 2 interceptors, tasked with stopping the plunging ballistic warheads, rose on thicker columns of smoke, their dual-stage motors pushing them to Mach 3 in seconds. On the tactical displays, the 6 remaining carrier killers were being bracketed by 12 American interceptors, a 2-to-1 ratio designed to ensure total destruction. The Aegis computers were now calculating the terminal illumination for the missiles, directing high-energy beams from the destroyer's illuminators to paint the targets for the final 3 seconds of flight. The energy output was so high that any bird or insect in the path of the beam was instantly vaporized. The first of the YJ-12 cruise missiles attempted a high-G barrel roll at a range of 12 miles. It was a violent maneuver intended to break the radar lock of the American interceptors. But the evolved Sea Sparrow missile responded with a 60G turn that no human pilot could survive. The intercept occurred just 10 meters above the water. The explosion was a brilliant orange sphere that reflected off the white caps of the waves, followed by the sight of the Chinese missile's engine, being ripped from its mounting and skipping across the water for 300 meters before sinking. Seconds later, the sky above the strike group erupted in a series of 6 massive detonations as the Standard Missile-2s found the ballistic warheads. Unlike the high-altitude intercepts, these occurred within the atmosphere, creating thunderous booms that rolled across the ocean like a continuous wave of artillery fire. The white-hot fragments of the Chinese missiles were shredded by the blast fragmentation warheads of the American interceptors, turning the 6 deadly threats into a rain of harmless molten slag. The radar screens of the strike group momentarily showed no high-altitude threats remaining. But the battle below the clouds was still raging. The destroyer, DDG-117, reported that its forward Mark 41 cells were now 30% depleted. The logistics of the engagement were becoming a primary concern for the tactical action officer. The strike group had successfully neutralized 18 ballistic missiles in the high tier and 6 in the medium tier, but 8 of supersonic cruise missiles had survived the wall of Sea Sparrows. These 8 survivors were now less than 10 miles from the USS Gerald R. Ford, moving at over 2,000 miles per hour. They were so low that they were effectively invisible to the long-range radars of the cruisers, hidden by the curvature of the Earth and the physical mass of the sea. Inside the carrier, the ship's internal defense systems transitioned to autonomous mode. The hum of the electric motors for the close-in weapon systems became a high-pitched whine that could be heard through the bulkheads. The air on the flight deck was cold, but the metal of the weapons mounts was already warm from the electronic testing cycles. The crew of the Gerald R. Ford could do nothing more but trust in the layers of steel and silicon they had built around themselves. The Admiral watched the range. Countdown for the final 8 vampires. 8 miles, 7 miles, 6 miles. The time for long-range interceptors had passed. The battle was now a matter of point defense, where the margin for error was 0 and the time to impact was measured in the single digits of seconds. The United States Navy's most expensive asset was now staring down the final volley of a saturation strike that had already cost the adversary nearly $1 billion in ordnance. 4:35 in the morning. The starboard side of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The 8 surviving YJ-12 cruise missiles were now 5 miles out, traveling at Mach 3 and screaming just 15 meters above the churning whitecaps of the Philippine Sea. On the carrier's island, the Aegis SPY-6 radar arrays were locked into a high update terminal tracking mode, feeding a continuous stream of fire control data to the ship's innermost layer of defense. The air on the flight deck, once cold and salt-heavy, was suddenly scorched by the electrical hum of the point defense systems and the chemical heat of ready service ammunition. This was the final 60 seconds of the engagement, where the distance between a successful defense and a catastrophic hull breach was measured in hundreds of yards. The trigger was squeezed automatically by the ship's tactical computer. From the Mark 49 launchers located on the sponsons of the carrier, the rolling airframe missiles shrieked off their rails. Each missile was a white-hot streak of light, its solid rocket motor punching backward through the morning mist with a violent, high-pitched roar that could be felt in the marrow of every sailor's bones. The heat blast from the launches washed across the steel deck plates, momentarily raising the local temperature by hundreds of degrees and filling the air with the sharp, acrid stink of burning propellant. 16 of the small, highly agile interceptors spiraled into the sky, their dual-mode seekers locking onto the infrared heat signatures of the incoming Chinese missiles. The first YJ-12 was struck at a range of 3 miles. The rolling airframe missile punched straight through the nose cone of the cruise missile, detonating its blast fragmentation warhead directly against the Chinese guidance computer. The impact was not a singular bang, but a violent eruption of kinetic energy that tore the 5-meter missile into 3 distinct pieces. The warhead section, weighing 500 pounds, was sent flying upward in a ball of orange fire before it plummeted into the mother, sea, while the remaining fuselage was shredded into thousands of glowing fragments that peppered the surface of the water like lethal hail. As the remaining 7 missiles closed to within 2,000 yards, the phalanx close-in weapon systems on the carrier's corners spun up to their full 6,000 rounds per minute firing rate. The sound was a continuous, bone-shaking buzz, like a giant mechanical saw cutting through the sky. A stream of 20mm armor-piercing tungsten penetrators reached out across the dark water, creating a visible line of white tracers that stitched the air. The second and third Chinese missiles drove directly into this wall of lead. The tungsten rounds hammered into the airframes, crushing the set, intake ducts, and detonating the fuel cells instantly. Both missiles erupted into blinding white flashes of burning magnesium and jet fuel, their forward momentum carrying the flaming wreckage within 500 yards of the carrier's hull before they tumbled into the waves. The fourth and fifth missiles executed violent terminal pop-up maneuvers, leaping 200 meters into the air to dive onto the carrier's flight deck from above. The Gerald R. Ford shuddered as its commander ordered a hard-to-port defensive turn, the 100,000-ton hull heeling over and sending a massive wake crashing against the escort destroyers. But the defense was already tracking the leap. A second volley of rolling airframe missiles slammed into the ascending threats. One missile was severed completely at the midsection, its rear engine spinning wildly out of control while the warhead fell straight down into the sea. The other was blasted into a cloud of titanium fragments that rattled against the armored side of the carrier's superstructure, leaving long, blackened streaks on the gray paint but failing to penetrate the steel. The final 3 missiles were intercepted by the combined fire of the destroyer DDG-116, which had moved into a sacrificial screening position just 2 miles away. The destroyer's own 25mm guns and Sea Sparrow missiles blew the remaining vampires apart in a synchronized sequence of detonations that bleached the sky white for 3 full seconds. The pressure wave from the final explosion compressed the chests of the lookouts on the carrier's Vulture's row, the sound of detonation that cracked eardrums and left a ringing silence in its wake. Black smoke rose from 8 separate points on the horizon, the oily clouds settling heavily over the water. The burning pieces of the Chinese missiles were still hissing as they hit the surface, the sea extinguishing the white-hot metal with plumes of steam. For exactly 5 seconds, the radio channels of the strike group went silent as every operator stared at their screens, watching the last of the red icons flicker and vanish. Then, the silence was shattered by a burst of overlapping voices from the Combat Direction Center, reporting all targets destroyed and confirmed. The immediate aftermath was a scene of frantic, professional energy. Smoke from the defensive launches still hung low over the flight deck, smelling of sulfur and hot metal. The carrier had escaped without a single hit to its hull, but the air was still charged with the residue of the violence that had just occurred. The Aegis shield had held, but the deck was littered with the spent casings of the close-in weapon systems, and the launchers were empty. The 48 missile volley was gone, but the Pacific was no longer a place of peace. 4:36 in the morning. The electronic warfare module, deep within the island of the USS Gerald R. Ford. While the sky above the Philippine Sea was being torn apart by kinetic interceptors and exploding warheads, a second, invisible battle was being fought across the electromagnetic spectrum. The air inside the electronic warfare module was kept at a constant, bone-chilling 62 degrees to protect the massive processing arrays, and it smelled of ozone and the faint plastic scent of high-density server racks running at maximum capacity. This was the silent war, where the goal was not to blow the enemy out of the sky, but to blind, deafen, and deceive the silicon brains guiding the 48 incoming missiles. The primary weapon in this unseen theater was the ANSLQ-32 Sierra Golf version 7, part of the Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program, or SEWIP. This system did not fire a single physical bullet, yet it was responsible for neutralizing the most dangerous aspect of the Chinese saturation strike. the terminal radar seekers of the YJ-12 and DF-21 Delta missiles. As the missiles entered their final search phase, the SEWIP system unleashed a torrent of high-energy radio frequency noise, flooding the enemy's radar receivers with a wall of electronic whiteout that made it impossible for them to distinguish the carrier from the surrounding waves. On the tactical consoles, the electronic warfare officers watched as the incoming missiles' guidance systems began to jitter. The red tracks, which had been steady and purposeful, began to weave and wobble as the missile's onboard computers struggled to maintain a lock. The SEWIP system was not just jamming the missiles. It was performing digital-to-analog spoofing, creating a dozen false radar returns that looked exactly like the USS Gerald R. Ford. To the sensors of the incoming DF-21 Delta ballistic missiles, it appeared as if there were suddenly 12 aircraft carriers in the water, each one miles apart from the actual target. At coordinates 15 degrees 5 minutes north, 124 degrees 8 minutes east, the carrier's defense reached a critical moment. Two of the supersonic cruise missiles had successfully filtered through the electronic noise and were beginning to reacquire the ship's actual hull. The order was given to deploy the active soft kill measures. From the Mach 53 decoy launchers located on the carrier's quarters, 4 Nulka active missile decoys were launched into the air. The Nulka was a unique piece of engineering. A hovering rocket that looked like a silver cylinder with a small, rotating antenna on top. It did not fly away. Instead, it hovered in mid-air, matching the speed of the carrier while emitting a massive radar cross-section. To the incoming YJ-12 missiles, the Nulka decoy appeared to be a much larger and more attractive target than the Gerald R. Ford itself. The air around the decoys shimmered with the heat of their small rocket motors, and the scent of chemical propellant mingled with the salt air. As they drifted away from the ship's side, one of the Chinese cruise missiles, fooled by the Nulka's deceptive signal, veered sharply away from the carrier at a distance of only 2,000 meters. It locked onto the hovering decoy and accelerated to its maximum speed, diving into the water 300 yards behind the decoy, in a massive plume of white spray and black smoke. The second missile, confused by the shifting electronic signatures, lost its lock entirely and skipped harmlessly over the carrier's flight deck, missing the island by less than 50 meters before its fuel ran out and it tumbled into the sea 5 miles away. The coordination between the kinetic interceptors and the electronic warfare suite was managed by the ship's self-defense system. This computer-controlled brain ensured that the standard missiles did not accidentally target the friendly Nulka decoys or get confused by the ship's own jamming signals. The environment on the bridge was one of clinical precision, even as the invisible waves of energy being pumped out by the ship's arrays were powerful enough to interfere with civilian electronics for 50 miles in every direction. The Admiral watched the electronic order of battle display. Of the 48 missiles launched, the SEWIP and Nulka systems were credited with successfully seducing or blinding at least 10 targets that might have otherwise required a kinetic intercept. This soft kill capability saved 24 precious interceptor missiles for the next wave of the attack. The silent war had proved to be just as lethal as the one fought with fire and steel, providing the final layer of the Aegis shield that ensured the carrier remained untouched. As the last of the jamming cycles began to wind down, the electronic warfare officers allowed themselves a single moment to breathe. The air in the module was still cold, but the tension had broken. The carrier was still transmitting, its radar was still searching, and its hull was still whole. The invisible wall had held, and the electromagnetic spectrum belonged to the United States Navy once again. 4:37 in the morning. The bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The silence that followed the final detonation was heavy, an almost physical weight that pressed against the eardrums of every sailor on the bridge. For 5 minutes, the air had been a screaming chaos of rocket motors and high explosive transitions. But now, the only sound was the low, rhythmic thrum of the 4 propeller shafts, and the constant, clinical hum of the cooling fans. The bridge windows, armored glass several inches thick, were smeared with a fine gray residue. the particulate remains of interceptor exhaust and vaporized Chinese titanium that had drifted back through the cold Pacific air. At coordinates 15 degrees 4 minutes north, 124 degrees 7 minutes east, the tactical air picture began to stabilize. The primary radar operator, his hands still hovering over the console, as if expecting a ghost to reappear, stared at the empty glass. The 48 red diamonds that had threatened to erase the strike group from the map were gone. There were no secondary tracks, no lingering low-altitude signatures, and no ballistic arcs appearing from the mainland. The sky was once again just a vast, dark expanse of nitrogen and oxygen, reclaimed by the United States Navy. "All clear, sir," the tactical action officer reported, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his professional composure. "Radar is clean. We have 48 confirmed kills out of 48 launches," the shield held. The admiral did not immediately respond. He stepped toward the forward bridge windows, looking out over the bow. 5 miles to the north, the cruiser CG-73 was a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn horizon, its forward deck still radiating heat from the massive missile launches. Further out, the two destroyers were beginning to pull back into their standard defensive stations, their wake carving white lines into the black water. The air outside smelled of salt, diesel, and the sharp, metallic tang of burnt ozone, a sensory reminder of the hundreds of millions of dollars in ordnance that had just been expended to maintain the sovereignty of the carrier. The damage assessment teams began their sweep of the USS Gerald R. While the hull had not been struck by a warhead, the sheer physical stress of the engagement had left its mark. The vibration from the rapid-fire close-in weapon systems had shattered several secondary light fixtures in the lower decks, and the heat from the rolling airframe missile launches had scorched the non-skid coating on the sponsons. Most significantly, a large piece of debris from a neutralized YJ-12 cruise missile, a jagged section of an engine intake, had slammed into the side of the flight deck at Mach 1. It had not penetrated the armored steel, but it had left a deep, blackened gouge and twisted a section of the safety netting. Below the waterline, the engineering teams checked the status of the two A-1B nuclear reactors. The massive electrical surge required to power the AN SPY-6 radar and the electromagnetic catapults had pushed the systems to their limits, but the reactors had performed flawlessly. The ship's internal temperature was beginning to drop back to normal levels as the high-powered processors exited their combat overclocked states. The environment inside the ship was transitioning from a fortress under siege back to a floating city, though the tension remained coiled in the muscles of every sailor. The casualty report was the most critical piece of data. The admiral waited as the reports from the escort ships were synthesized. One minor injury on the destroyer, DDG-116, the communications officer announced. A sailor was thrown against a bulkhead during the hard-to-port maneuver. No fatalities. No personnel lost across the strike group. It was a staggering victory for American naval technology. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force had thrown the full weight of a regional brigade at a single carrier strike group, and they had failed to draw blood. The logic of the saturation, strike the idea that enough missiles could always overwhelm a defense, had been countered by the superior processing speed of the Aegis network and the discipline of the crews. The 48 incoming missiles had been pulverized, evaporated, or seduced into the sea without reaching their target. However, the mood on the bridge was not one of celebration. Every officer in the room knew the math of the engagement. They had successfully defended the ship, but their magazines were now dangerously low. To stop 48 missiles, they had fired over 100 interceptors. The strike group was now a formidable shield with fewer plates, and the journey back to a friendly Dr. Cumming port for rearming would be the most dangerous transit of the decade. The admiral looked at the empty radar screen and knew that while they had won the battle of the first 5 minutes, the war of logistics was just beginning. 4:45 in the morning, the Philippine Sea, 300 miles east of the Luzon Strait. The immediate adrenaline of the missile engagement had faded. replaced by the grueling, rhythmic labor of the United States Navy's logistical backbone. On the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Admiral watched the digital inventory of the strike group's magazines. The numbers were sobering. To defeat the 48 missile saturation strike, the cruiser and its 2 escorting destroyers had expended 112 interceptor missiles in less than 5 minutes. This represented nearly 40% of the total vertical launch system capacity for the entire strike group. While the ships were still combat effective, their ability to weather a second or third volley of the same magnitude was now severely compromised. At coordinates 15 degrees 8 minutes north, 124 degrees 12 minutes east, the strike group began the complex process of an underway replenishment. Emerging from the darkness to the east was the USNS Supply, a fast combat support ship operated by the Military Sealift Command. This massive vessel, displacing nearly 50,000 tons, was the lifeline of the fleet. The environment between the ships was one of high-tension precision. The 2 vessels were steaming side by side at a speed of 15 knots, separated by only 45 meters of churning, white-capped water. The air was thick with the heavy scent of marine diesel and the sharp, cold spray of the Pacific. The physical reality of naval logistics in 2026 was a study in brute force and delicate engineering. From the deck of the replenishment ship, massive fuel lines were shot across the gap by pneumatic line-throwing guns. The thin cords quickly replaced by heavy steel cables and thick rubber hoses. The span wire was tensioned, and the fueling probes were mated to the carrier's receiving stations with a heavy, metallic clunk that could be felt through the deck plates. Thousands of gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel and DF-2 diesel began to pulse through the lines, the heartbeat of the strike group's endurance. However, the most critical deficit was one that could not be solved in the open ocean. The Mark 41 vertical launch system cells on the cruiser CG-73 and the destroyers DDG-116 and DDG-117 were empty, their steel hatches blackened by the heat of the standard missile launches. Unlike fuel or food, the heavy interceptor missiles, each weighing over 3,000 pounds and measuring nearly 7 meters in length, could not be reloaded at sea in anything other than perfectly calm conditions. The rolling 4-meter swells of the Philippine Sea made a crane-based missile transfer an impossibility. The strike group was a boxer who had won the first round but had used up nearly half of his stamina.
The 7th Fleet is positioned here.
The Admiral reviewed the strategic options with his executive officer. The nearest secure deep-water port capable of rearming the vertical launch systems was Naval Base Guam, located at latitude 13 degrees 28 minutes north, longitude 144 degrees 39 minutes east. The transit would take approximately 48 hours at high speed. This meant the carrier strike group would be operating in a state of reduced defensive capacity for 2 full days, moving through waters where the adversary likely had submarines and long-range bombers waiting for an opening. On the flight deck of the Gerald R. Ford, the activity was equally intense. The FA-18 fighter jets and F-35 Bravo fighters that had participated in the outer air battle were being hot-pitted, refueled, and rearmed, while their engines were still running. Ordnance crews, wearing red jerseys and moving with practice speed, pushed carts of AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles across the deck. The sound of pneumatic wrenches and the low-frequency roar of the jet engines created a symphony of industrial power. Smelled of burnt rubber, jet exhaust, and the chemical tang of hydraulic fluid. Every sailor knew that the window of vulnerability was open, and the speed of the turnaround was the only way to narrow it. The logistics report from the cruiser indicated that while they had plenty of food and fuel, their inventory of Standard Missile 6 interceptors was down to only 12 rounds. The destroyers were in a similar state, having used the majority of their evolved Sea Sparrow missiles to create the wall of steel that saved the carrier. The United States Navy's distributed lethality doctrine was being tested by the sheer math of attrition. To maintain the shield, the strike group would have to rely more heavily on its electronic warfare suites and its air wing until they could reach the pier at Guam. The admiral turned back to the tactical display. The replenishment oiler was now detaching. Its mission complete. The strike group began to bank to the east, increasing speed to 25 knots as they turned toward the safety of the Marianas. The morning sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, casting a long, pale light over the water where the debris of the Chinese missiles had long since sunk. The cost of the defense had been measured in millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of pounds of high-tech hardware, but the carrier remained afloat. The logistics of survival were now the primary mission of the fleet. 8 in the morning on the 3rd of April, 2026. The National Military Command Center inside the Pentagon and the Indo-Pacific Command Headquarters in Hawaii were already vibrating with the decoded data from the Philippine Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford was still 2 days from the safety of Guam, but the digital ghost of the engagement had already traveled around the world at the speed of light. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Washington, D.C., the air was cool and smelled of recycled oxygen and industrial floor wax, a sharp contrast to the salt-heavy humidity of the Pacific. Senior officials and analysts gathered around high-definition displays, watching the playback of 48 red icons being systematically erased from the tactical map. This was the moment the strategic calculus of the 21st century shifted. For a decade, the global military narrative had been dominated by the anti-access area denial threat. Specifically, the belief that the American aircraft carrier was a lumbering relic, easily neutralized by massed missile fire. At coordinates 21 degrees north, 157 degrees west, the commanders at Indo-Pacific Command reviewed the AN SPY-6 radar performance metrics. The data was undeniable. The zero-hit outcome against a full-scale saturation strike by DF-21 Delta and YJ-12 missiles was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological earthquake. The myth of the carrier killer had been punctured by the reality of the Aegis shield. The Chinese rocket force had committed 48 of its most advanced weapons to a single operation and had achieved zero impact, a failure that would force every military planner in the region to rewrite their playbooks. The geopolitical ripples were immediate and profound. In Tokyo, Taipei, and Manila, the news of the successful defense of the USS Gerald R. Ford acted as a stabilizing force. The visual confirmation of the strike group's invulnerability, the sight of the carrier steaming unharmed through the debris-strewn waters, reinforced the American commitment to the region. The air in these capitals was thick with a new kind of tension, but it was coupled with a renewed sense of security. The United States Navy had demonstrated that its centerpiece could not only survive the most modern threats, but could do so with professional, clinical efficiency. Inside the White House Situation Room, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the dry heat of high-end electronics. The president was briefed on the magazine-to-kill ratio. While the victory was total, the cost was high. The expenditure of over 100 Standard Missile-6 and Standard Missile-2 interceptors had depleted the immediate regional stock of high-end ordnance. This victory through attrition was a warning that the industrial base of the United States would need to accelerate its production of interceptors to match the adversary's launch capacity. The strategic win was clear, but the long-term logistical challenge was now the primary focus of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The adversary's reaction was one of stunned silence, followed by a rapid restructuring of their coastal defense units. Satellite imagery showed mobile launchers in southeastern China returning to their mountain hangars under heavy cover of darkness. The failure of the 48 missile volley had exposed a critical gap in their targeting logic and electronic warfare resilience. The air over the Chinese mainland was heavy with the pressure of a failed high-stakes gamble, as military leaders scrambled to explain how $1 billion in precision weaponry had been neutralized by a single American strike group. On the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the sailors were oblivious to the high-level geopolitical shifts. They were focused on the physical reality of their mission. The air was cold, and the horizon was a pale, flat gray as they continued their high-speed transit toward the Marianas. The carrier remained a symbol of power, but it was now a symbol that had been tested by fire and proven resilient. The strategic ripples of the engagement would be studied for decades in naval war colleges, but for the crew, the success was measured in the simple fact that the ship was still moving, the reactors were still humming, and the deck was still clear for flight operations. The admiral stood on the flag bridge, looking at the sunrise. Reflecting off the blue Pacific, he knew that the battle had changed the rules of engagement for the foreseeable future. The invulnerability of the carrier was no longer an assumption, it was a demonstrated fact. But he also knew that the next time the red icons appeared on the screen, the adversary would have learned from their mistakes. The shield had held, but the war of technology and will was far from over. 8 in the morning on the 8th of April, 2026. Apra Harbor, Guam. The USS Gerald R. Ford was finally moored at Sierra Wharf, its massive gray hull towering over the concrete pier like a mountain of steel. The air in the harbor was humid and heavy, carrying the scent of tropical salt, diesel fuel, and the scorched, metallic tang of the forward missile sponsons. For the first time in 10 days, the ship's dual A-1B nuclear reactors were at a reduced power state, and the 5,000 sailors on board were beginning the grueling, high-stakes process of rearming the fleet. The official after-action report, classified at the highest level by the Office of Naval Intelligence, summarized the 5-minute engagement that had occurred hundreds of miles to the west. The data was unequivocal. In a span of precisely 300 seconds, the carrier strike group had successfully identified, tracked, and neutralized 48 incoming anti-ship missiles. This included 24 DF-21 Delta hypersonic ballistic missiles and 24 YJ-12 supersonic sea-skimming cruise missiles. It was the most concentrated and lethal aerial assault ever directed at a single naval formation. In the history of modern warfare, the technical superiority of the United States Navy was the primary factor in the victory. The Aegis SPY-6 radar arrays on the USS Gerald R. Ford had performed flawlessly, maintaining a continuous track on 48 targets, moving at varying speeds and altitudes. The cooperative engagement capability had allowed the carrier to act as the brain of the fleet, directing the fire of the cruiser CG-73 and the destroyers DDG-116 and DDG-117. This sensor fusion ensured that every one of the 112 interceptor missiles launched from the Long-Range Standard Missile 6 to the Point Defense Rolling Airframe Missile had a specific, data-driven target. The success rate of the defense was exactly 100%. Not a single Chinese warhead had reached its terminal objective. The report noted that while the kinetic kills were the most visible part of the battle, the silent work of the SEWIP version 7 electronic warfare suite and the Nolka active decoys had neutralized 10% of the threat through non-kinetic means. This combination of hard kill and soft kill measures created a multi-layered shield that the adversary's saturation strategy simply could not penetrate. However, the report also highlighted the staggering logistical cost of the engagement. To achieve 48 kills, the strike group had expended nearly half of its total missile inventory. The pier at Guam was now a scene of intense industrial activity as cranes lifted 3,000-pound missile canisters into the vertical launch system cells of the destroyers. The air was filled with the rhythmic clatter of pneumatic tools and the shouts of ordnance crews working in 12-hour shifts. The United States had proven it could win the battle of technology, but the battle of the industrial base, the ability to replenish these sophisticated weapons faster than the enemy could build new ones, was the new strategic priority. The human element was the final and most important factor cited in the summary. The discipline of the sailors in the Combat Direction Center, the skill of the F-35 Bravo and FA-18 pilots, and the resilience of the engineering teams had been the true foundation of the Aegis shield. There were no panic-induced errors, no system failures under pressure, and no hesitation in the face of an unprecedented threat. The crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford had operated with a professional efficiency that confirmed their status as the most capable maritime force on the planet. As the sun rose higher over the Philippine Sea, the carrier strike group prepared to return to its station. The gouge on the flight deck from the falling debris had been repaired, the magazines were being refilled, and the radar was once again sweeping the horizon. The engagement of April 3, 2026 had redefined the future of naval combat. It had shown that while the aircraft carrier could be targeted, it could not be easily killed. The shield of the Republic remained unbroken, and the United States Navy continued to hold the line in the deep blue waters of the Pacific. The battle was over, the report was signed, and the mission continued.